I grew up in a small town where life flowed smoothly, and changes happened so rarely that you could count them on your fingers. Our two-story house was very ordinary: a white facade, a porch with a faded wooden bench, a small garden in which my mother planted tulips every spring, always rejoicing at their first shoots, as if she had seen this miracle for the first time. Our family lived in this house: my father, who ran a small cafe in the city center; my mother, who stayed at home most of the time, doing household chores; and my older sister Grace, the person around whom the whole world seemed to revolve, including our family. Grace was only 2 years older than me, but sometimes it seemed to me that there was a gap between us, not in a couple of years, but in the whole universe. From an early age, she was bright, confident, and purposeful, a true star whose light dazzled others, forcing them to squint enthusiastically and acknowledge her unconditional superiority. And I was a shadow. A shadow that always stayed behind, did not receive its moment of glory, did not receive the same admiring glances, but nevertheless invariably followed her, trying not to lose her own face in the light of someone else's radiance. Dad was proud of both of us, but it was obvious who he liked to show his family and friends more. At family dinners, he talked excitedly about what heights Grace had achieved, with what brilliance she had won another speaking competition, or how her essay had been praised by the headmaster himself. "Have you heard about Grace's SAT results?" "What is it?" he asked, pouring wine into glasses, and the relatives gasped together when he named her scores. "She's just incredible, she'll go far," Mom echoed, clasping her hands in admiration, while Grace smiled with polite modesty, as if she hadn't heard this delight hundreds of times. At such moments, I felt like I was becoming a ghost. Of course, I also managed to do some things, but no one was in a hurry to celebrate them. When I won first place at the science fair, I proudly brought home the certificate, but as soon as I entered the living room, I heard my mother enthusiastically telling Grace, "This presentation was simply brilliant, dear. You'll go so far." I froze on the threshold, still holding my reward in my hands, but no one looked in my direction. As always, Grace got the praise, and all I got was silence. She got the best new phone, and I got her old one with a cracked screen. She wore designer clothes, and I received her used clothes, which my mother diligently ironed, trying to make them look new. She shone at school, and I just existed against her background, knowing that my achievements would never be so significant in the eyes of the family. "Stella," my mother once told me as we were folding laundry in the drying room, "you really should think about practical career options. Maybe a job in a store or cafe, like your father's. There is nothing wrong with honest work." I felt this remark sting painfully from the inside, but I didn't say anything, looking down at the stack of neatly folded shirts. They didn't even try to hide their opinion about my prospects. I'm used to being second best. I'm used to the fact that my place is in the shadows. I'm used to constant comparisons, to subtle, barely perceptible jabs, to the fact that in this house, just fine is tantamount to failure. But if there was one thing that made me different from Grace, it was that I never argued, never shouted, or proved that I was admirable too. I silently absorbed all this, folded it deep inside, and learned patience. And then that day came. The day Grace received her college acceptance letter. It was a triumph, a celebration that my parents seemed to have lived for the last few years. When she tore open the envelope, beaming with pride, and read the letter aloud, a storm of jubilation began in the house. Mom, with tears in her eyes, rushed to hug her. Dad immediately grabbed the phone to call his relatives and tell them this good news. In the evening, my mother cooked her favorite dinner, something delicious, with meat and expensive spices, the aroma of which spread throughout the house while I sat at the table, shifting food on a plate, and tried to imagine what my own holiday would look like. Will I have the same one? 2 years after that evening, when the whole house was cheering over Grace's admission, when I was sitting at the table and silently dreaming about my own holiday, I should have known better than to harbor any hopes, but when it was my turn to talk about the future, when I timidly brought up the subject at the family table at dinner, The answer turned out to be so predictable that it only hurt more. I tried hard, didn't let myself fall behind in my studies, joined clubs, attended extra classes, took part-time jobs to save at least some money for admission, but all this, as it turned out, didn't matter at all. The day I first started talking about college, my mom's laugh sounded unexpectedly harsh, even dismissive, as if I'd said something ridiculous and ridiculous. She shook her head, as if guiding me on the right path, and said with a strange smile, "Stella, be realistic. We just can't afford to send you to college. Besides, you're not really suited for this." I felt something tighten inside, but despite the lump rising in my throat, I forced myself to ask the question that had been bothering me for a long time. "But what about the money you've been saving for Grace?" My voice traitorously trembled, but I hoped they wouldn't notice it. Dad put down his fork, cleared his throat, and after a short, agonizing pause, replied, "This other." Grace had a clear path, exceptional grades, and serious prospects. And you, well, practical work would be more suitable for you. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I probably knew that this would happen, but I still couldn't believe what I was hearing. But I could work during my studies. I protested desperately. "Please, just help me get started. We could borrow from relatives, take out a loan. I swear, I'll pay every penny back, even with interest. I can make it official, with a lawyer, if you want." But Mom just shook her head coldly, not even bothering to look at me. "We never borrow from anyone, on principle. And we're not going to change our principles for you. You need to come to terms with your limitations and find a suitable job." I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark, clutching the blanket, and cried softly, but the tears quickly turned to determination. If my own parents didn't believe in me, if they didn't see potential in me, I'll find those who will. The next morning, I went to the only people who had ever supported me unconditionally, to those who always looked at me not through the prism of comparisons with Grace, but as an independent person. I went to my grandparents, sat down at their kitchen table, put my hands in front of me, trembling with tension, and said softly, almost in a whisper, "Grandpa, I need your help." I explained everything that had accumulated over the years. Through tears I talked about how I felt invisible in my own family, how I wanted to study, I wanted to prove that I was capable of more, I wanted to break out of this circle of bias and inequality. Grandpa listened in silence, a mixture of anger and deep sadness froze in his eyes, and when I finished, he said softly but firmly, "We don't have any savings, honey. But give me some time. No grandson of mine should have to suffer the ruin of his dreams like that." The next few weeks turned into a roller coaster of emotions. At first, there was disappointment that the bank had rejected the loan application, then shock when Grandpa, after much thought, announced that he was selling their old country house and the plot of land on which it stood. This property was their quiet refuge, the place where they spent their youth, but without hesitation, he decided to sacrifice it for the sake of my future. The sale brought in just enough to cover my tuition fees. I chose to study in a city as far from home as possible, because every reminder that my family didn't believe in me, didn't want to invest in my future, caused too much pain. The day I left, Mom and Dad didn't even come to say goodbye. Only Grandma and Grandpa were standing at the bus stop. Grandma held my hands tightly, and Grandpa silently wiped his eyes, passing off the tears as something else, maybe just dust or fatigue. But I knew the truth. I knew I wasn't alone. From that day on, I completely severed my relationship with my parents. Years have passed. When it was time to return to my hometown, the changes I went through made this return strange, even painful. I moved in with my grandparents in their smaller house now. They lost their suburban silence for the sake of my future, and this sacrifice meant everything to me. Every time I entered their modest but cozy house, I remembered what a real family looked like, real support. After 4 years of grueling work, sleepless nights, exams, worries, and hopes, I finally got my diploma in investment management. But the reality turned out to be much harsher than I expected. I returned to my hometown with big dreams and a freshly printed diploma in my hands, but I was faced with the cold truth. The labor market was in no hurry to welcome new graduates. Week after week, I sent out resumes, filled out questionnaires, and went through interviews that ended with polite refusals. My savings were dwindling, and the uncertainty of the future was getting heavier. But I've already proved once that I'm not going to give up. And if I have to fight for my place in this world again, I will do it. In the end, after months of waiting, endless interviews, filled out questionnaires and polite refusals, I finally got a position in a small trading company. It was far from what I imagined when I was studying all night hoping to get into a prestigious investment firm, but it was a start, and I clung to it like a drowning man to a lifeline. The job was simple, mostly administrative tasks, order processing, and working with clients, but it gave me a stable income, the ability to pay bills, and most importantly, a sense of independence that I had missed so much in my previous life. I found a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. It was small, with peeling wallpaper and an old, creaking floor, but it was my space, a place for which I paid with my own money, not with the handouts of my parents, not with the charity of my father, who never believed that I could survive on my own. I was proud of it, proud that I was able to arrange my life without their participation. And just when I was starting to feel like maybe things were finally getting better, the phone call I least expected rang. Grace's voice came on the other end of the line, sweet, honey, sweet, and a little strained, as if she knew in advance that I might not want to listen to her. Stella, it's been so long. You should come to dinner this weekend. I'd love to catch up. There was a forced lightness in her voice, but I wanted to believe that maybe time had really changed everything, that we had both matured, that now we could build a relationship not as rivals, but as two grown women, as sisters, as we should have been from the very beginning. I was wrong. As soon as I entered Grace's house that evening, I realized I was trapped. My parents were already sitting in the living room, looking as if their presence here was an absolutely natural phenomenon, although I hadn't seen them since the day I left to study. Grace's boyfriend was sitting next to her, a sleek man in an expensive suit, with immaculately coiffed hair and a cold smile that made it clear that my presence here was nothing more than an annoying formality for him. The interrogation began as soon as we sat down at the table. Mom raised her fork in the air, paused for a moment, as if deciding where to start, and then, with her usual feigned concern, she asked, "So tell us about this job of yours." I took a deep breath, realizing that there was a trap in this particular question. "I work for a trading company," I replied calmly, trying not to show my irritation. "It's small, but—" "A trading company?" Grace interrupted me with a light laugh. "You mean those discount stores? To be honest, you don't need a college degree for this. Anyone can walk in from the street and get a job like this." I clenched my teeth, not allowing myself to snap, but before I could respond, Mom had already picked up the conversation, turning to Grace's boyfriend. "Unlike, for example, Bean, Grace's mom, who works as a manager at the city bank." "Or Thomas," Grace intervened, proudly looking at her chosen one. "He's a lawyer at Anderson and Pierce." Grace's boyfriend nodded smugly, taking the praise for granted. "The leading law firm in the state." "I told you so," the father sighed, idly twirling the glass of wine in his hands. "College is not necessary for people like you. Such a waste of your grandfather's inheritance." I felt my hands clench into fists under the table. "Oh, come on," he grinned, leaning back in his chair. "My offer is still valid. I could use a waitress with a college degree in a cafe." He raised his glass as if offering a toast. "Imagine how impressed the customers would be. Do you want French fries to go with this? From a graduate of investment management." They laughed. Everyone except me. I stared at my plate, moving the food with my fork, just like I used to do when I was a kid, when I sat at the same table, listening to Grace's endless praises. "Where did you say you live now?" Grace suddenly asked, even though I hadn't mentioned it yet. I answered quietly, I found a place on Cedar Street. There was a tense silence in the room for a second, and then there were surprised exclamations. Cedar Street? Mom gasped, as if I had just admitted that I had settled under the bridge. Grace rolled her eyes in mock concern. Oh, Stella, this is literally the worst neighborhood in town. She paused, letting everyone realize how terrible she thought the news was, and then added with a malicious smile, well, you know, there are people living there who just can't afford anything better. Beggars, Mom whispered, not even trying to hide her contempt. And they laughed again. At that moment, something inside me snapped. It's been so many years, but they haven't changed. They remained just as cruel, judgmental, and condescending. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly on the floor. You know what? My voice sounded flat, but there was a hint of metal in it that hadn't been there before. I'd rather be a beggar than be like any of you. They froze. At least I achieved everything on my own, not sitting on someone else's neck and not living on Dad's money. I grabbed my purse and headed for the door, ignoring their protests, disapproving shouts, and attempts to stop me. When I stepped out into the cold night, gulping air as if I had just emerged from a stuffy room, I vowed to myself that I would never let them invade my life again. Life has a funny way of surprising you, just when you think you've reached a dead end. I still worked in a small trading company, did my job responsibly, took on any task, trying to prove to myself and others that I was capable of more, but deep down I felt that I was stuck. While my former classmates were building brilliant careers in prestigious companies, I continued to spend my days in a small office with yellowed walls, processing orders and writing reports, knowing that my potential and ambitions stretched much further. It seemed to me that I was drowning in a gray routine, and the only thing that kept me afloat was the thought that someday everything would change. And then one day, in the middle of a normal working day, I got a call that turned my life upside down. A name I hadn't seen in years appeared on the screen, Lisa, my old college roommate. Stella, you won't believe this. Her voice was literally ringing with excitement. Do you remember how we always talked about working at Maxwell Investment Group? They're opening an office in your city and looking for fresh talent. I've already put in a good word for you. My heart started pounding, and my breathing stopped. Maxwell Investment Group is one of the biggest names in the world of investment management, a company whose name was pronounced with respect and envy, a place where the best minds of the industry worked. I couldn't miss this chance. I didn't sleep a wink that night, updating my resume, thinking about every line, honing every word, and then spent the next week preparing for the interview, rereading books, reviewing courses, repeating possible answers to questions aloud, imagining myself in a meeting room with the best of the best. And so, on the day of the interview, I walked into their temporary office, straightening my back and clenching my hands into fists, trying to stop my fingers from shaking. It seemed to me that my whole life had led me to this very moment. The interview was not easy. They tested me on all fronts, from an in-depth analysis of market trends to a detailed analysis of investment strategies, but I did not flinch. All the extra hours I spent staying late at the office to study financial reports, all the research I did in my free time analyzing the mechanisms of the stock market, it all paid off. A week later, I got a call. We would like you to join our team. I was taken over from the very first day. While other employees went home at 5 in the evening, I stayed late, developing new investment strategies, finalizing project proposals, plunging into work with my head. My first major project was managing the investment portfolio of a medium-sized technology company, and when it brought 40% profit in the first quarter, I started to get noticed. Stella, this is an impressive piece of work, my supervisor said during the semi-annual review. Along with the praise, I received a bonus that exceeded my annual salary at my former company. But it wasn't enough. I worked harder, took on bigger projects, analyzed failed investments and found ways to turn them into gold mines. My reputation was growing, and the bonuses were getting bigger, but I had a clear plan for every penny. 2 years after I started working at Maxwell Investment Group, I walked into a luxury car dealership. The seller probably thought I had the wrong door, until I confidently pointed out their top model and said I was taking it. An hour later, I drove up to my grandparents' house. The car sparkled in the sunlight, and there was a huge red ribbon on the roof. What? What's it? Grandpa looked at me as if he couldn't believe his eyes. I handed him the keys. It's yours now. His lips twitched, he opened his mouth, but the words seemed to get stuck somewhere in his throat. And Grandma put her hands to her cheeks, not hiding her tears. But that was just the beginning. The following month, I signed a deal to buy an amazing apartment in the Heights neighborhood, the most prestigious new complex in the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble countertops, and a breathtaking view. It was a place I could only dream of. One morning, as I was leaving the house with a cup of coffee, I heard a voice that immediately made me stop. Stella. I turned around and saw Grace. She stood there in her perfectly tailored designer tracksuit, looking like she'd seen a ghost. What are you doing here? I sipped my coffee slowly, enjoying this moment. Oh, I live here, I said casually, nodding toward the penthouse. I just bought it. Actually. Grace's expression was priceless. A mixture of disbelief, shock, and something else. For the first time in my life, I saw envy in the eyes of my perfect sister. But the most amazing thing happened a week later. My phone rang, and when I looked at the screen, I froze. Parents. They haven't called me in years. But what was even more surprising was that they were nearby and wanted to come in. I agreed. More out of curiosity than for any other reason. When my parents entered my apartment, their expressions were priceless. Mom's gaze started from the panoramic windows to the designer furniture, lingered on the soft light of expensive lamps, glided over the perfectly laid parquet and stopped in the kitchen, where the light reflected in the marble counter made the space even more spacious and cold. Dad stood awkwardly at the entrance, as if he was afraid to touch anything, as if one careless move could ruin this world, which he had never belonged to. That's pretty impressive, Mom finally said, running her finger over the smooth surface of the countertop, as if checking for any dust left on it. You must be doing very well. I didn't answer, but just motioned for them to sit on my Italian leather sofa. They exchanged glances before Mom cleared her throat, demonstrating that they had a specific purpose for which they had come here. Well, we actually have some news, she began with the same fake lightness I remembered from childhood, when she tried to convince me to accept something that went against my interests. Grace is engaged to Thomas. They announced it last month at an engagement party. I nodded, keeping an indifferent expression on my face, but irritation prickled inside me. Of course, I wasn't invited to this party. They're planning a wedding in 6 months, Mom continued, her voice taking on a familiar note, an uncertain attempt to gently lead me to something I definitely wouldn't like. We offered to pay half of the expenses, as is customary. Dad shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes. But it looks like the total budget is. She hesitated for a moment, as if she didn't believe the figure herself, and then exhaled, $300,000. I almost choked on the water. $300,000? I asked, hoping I'd misheard. Thomas's family has certain expectations, Mom explained quickly, as if that explained everything. They are very well known in society, and when we announced that we would cover half, we still did not know the exact amount. She paused, but her gaze was meaningful. Now you need $150,000, I finished calmly for her. Exactly. Mom beamed, obviously glad that I understood everything correctly. And because you're doing so well, you live in this beautiful apartment and work for such a prestigious company. Do you want me to give you the money? I looked at her directly, not letting her get away from the point of the question. A loan, Dad intervened, trying to soften the situation. We're asking for a loan, of course. We'll give it back to you. We can even make it official. We know that the amount is quite a lot. But we can't back down now, Mom interrupted, her voice strained now. It would be so awkward with Thomas's family. They expect a certain standard. I chuckled. Like when I wanted to go to college? I asked quietly. Mom froze. When I begged you for help, when I offered to sign a legal document promising to repay the debt? Mom's cheeks flushed. It was different, she murmured. In a different way? I leaned forward, watching them both lose themselves in my gaze. Because it was me who asked. Because you said then that you don't borrow money? Stella, be reasonable, Dad began, but I raised my hand, silencing him. Reasonable? I stood up, crossing my arms over my chest. How reasonable were you when you told me I wasn't fit for college? How reasonable were you when you offered me a job as a waitress instead of helping me get an education? How wise were you to let Grandpa sell his property to support me while you were saving all your money for Grace? It's not fair. Mom exclaimed, but her voice faltered. No, it's not fair that you're here just because you need something from me. My words sounded cold, even cruel, but I couldn't help myself. You didn't invite me to the engagement party. You haven't talked to me in years, and now all of a sudden you want $150,000. I went to the door and opened it. I don't give bail money, I said, gesturing for them to leave. I thought it was a family tradition. Isn't that right? Mom's face turned red with anger. How dare you throw our own words in our face after all we've done for you? Everything you've done for me? I laughed bitterly. Please leave. Right now. Mom abruptly got up from the couch, muttering something about my ingratitude, and Dad, without looking me in the eye, followed her. When the door closed behind them, I felt something heavy fall off my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I opposed them on my own terms, in my home, from a position of strength. The next day, my phone rang again, but this time it was Grace. I was almost expecting this call, because my parents never dared to openly confront each other. They always preferred to hand over the reins of righteous anger to their eldest, perfect daughter, someone who had never known rejection. What's the matter with you? She blurted out without even saying hello. I leaned slightly in my office chair, watching as the setting sun painted the city in soft golden pink hues. Hi, Grace, I haven't heard your voice in a long time. Mom told me what happened. How can you be so selfish? I raised an eyebrow slightly, not hiding the irony, and sipped my coffee. Selfish? Is this wealth coming from you, Grace? We're a family, Stella. I chuckled. The family helps each other. You have money. Everyone knows that everything is fine with you. Why don't you help with my wedding? I could almost laugh at the absurdity of the whole situation. I'm a family now. What about that day when I was at your house and you all called me a beggar? How about when you made fun of where I live, when you made fun of my work? Was I family then, Grace? That was different, she snapped. Something else? I shook my head. No, it's exactly the same thing. The only difference is that now I'm the one with the money. We were just teasing. You're being ridiculous right now. No, the funny thing is that none of you talked to me for years until you needed my money. If you really need $150,000, why don't you ask our parents for it? They're your real family, aren't they? They've made it pretty clear to me over the years. There was a tense silence on the other end of the line, and then Grace exploded. Do you think you're much better than us now with your fancy apartment, your big job? You're still the same pathetic little sister who was never good enough. The line broke. I continued to sit in silence, feeling strangely calm. Previously, such words would have pierced through me, left wounds that I would have licked for weeks, convincing myself that I just needed to get better, that maybe someday they would recognize me. But now? Now I'm just tired of them. A week later, I was sitting at the table at my grandparents' house for Sunday dinner, a tradition I'd followed since college. The aroma of stewed meat, which Grandma cooked according to her secret recipe, was in the air, but this time something was different. She looked unusually quiet as she set the plates, and Grandpa avoided making eye contact with me. "Your parents called us yesterday," he finally said, clearing his throat. His voice was low and husky. I put down my fork. "Let me guess. They asked for money for the wedding." Grandma nodded, looking at me sadly. "They're desperate, I think. Your mother talked quite a lot about family obligations when we said that we were retired and we just didn't have that kind of money." Grandpa shook his head. But the most interesting thing happened later. I frowned. What else did they say? He slowly placed the glass of tea on the table. "Your mother had the audacity to offer us something to sell." "Sell what?" "The car." I froze. "What kind of car?" Grandpa met my gaze. "The one you gave me." I could feel the blood rushing to my face. Did she actually offer to sell you your gift?" Grandpa nodded. "That's when I hung up," he said with satisfaction in his voice. "I told her that, unlike some people, we don't sell gifts from family members who really care about us." My grandmother silently reached across the table and squeezed my hand. The three of us sat in silence, but it wasn't an awkward silence, not the kind that comes from understatement. It was an understanding. It was more than just a blood tie. Word spreads fast in a small town. But my parents made sure that it spread even faster. Within a few weeks, their version of events had spread throughout our extended family, among their acquaintances, and in the society in which they were so desperately trying to save face. I began to hear excerpts of their carefully thought-out narrative from completely unexpected sources. "Have you heard about the youngest daughter?" My mother's friend was gossiping loudly at the local grocery store, unaware that I was standing in the next aisle. "She got some great job and now she thinks she's too good for her family. She doesn't even want to talk to them, says they're not rich enough for her." And then, in the church. "You know, Stella's parents have such grief now," my mother's old acquaintances whispered after the service. "They raised an ungrateful daughter, and now she has abandoned them when they need help. But her parents did so much for her." At first I was angry. I was angry that they were trying to make me look like a monster, angry that their plaintive speeches had found an audience, angry that, despite all their neglect, they were now playing the role of victims. But soon the anger turned to disappointment. I didn't expect them to change anymore. I didn't hope that one day they would look at me and see not a little sister who was never good enough, but a man who made himself, who didn't break down, didn't let himself be trampled on. I'm just tired. And I knew that I was no longer going to justify my life to them. My relatives gave me disapproving looks when I visited my grandparents, as if I had done something unheard of, something so outrageous that it didn't even deserve to be discussed out loud. Someone looked at me with outright disapproval, someone with poorly concealed curiosity, and someone, like Cousin Linda, with a mixture of regret and displeasure, as if trying to decide whether she was disappointed in me or sympathetic. And then one evening the bell rang, and a name I hadn't seen in several years appeared on the screen: Aunt Marta, a woman with a voice like a taut string, always ready to become a judge and prosecutor in cases concerning family values. "Your mother told me that you don't even let her into your apartment when she comes to visit," she said without preamble. "How can you treat your mother like that?" I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I could have corrected the record. I could have told everyone how my parents only reached out when they needed money, how they never supported my dreams, how they ridiculed and humiliated me at every turn. I could have reminded them how coldly they turned away when I asked for help, and then they returned with feigned concern as soon as I got higher than they expected. But I realized a long time ago that trying to protect yourself from toxic people only gives them more reason to blame. "If you called to lecture me, Martha, then you shouldn't," I said calmly. She snorted. I just think you should reconsider your attitude toward your family. They love you, even if you don't always see it. I disconnected the call without bothering to answer. Instead, I focused on work, spent time with my grandparents, and let gossip swirl around me like autumn leaves in the wind, knowing that people would always talk. Grandma and Grandpa knew the truth. They lived every moment with me. And that was enough. But 2 weeks before the wedding, Grace made one last attempt. She showed up at my place without warning, in her most expensive outfit, perfumed with something too sweet, with that Hollywood smile she wore when she wanted to achieve something. "Stella, we need to talk," she said, walking past me into the living room, as if it were her apartment and not mine. I didn't move, crossing my arms over my chest and watching her settle down on my couch, looking at the interior with the air of a person evaluating a product. "It's been going on for a long time," she sighed, adjusting the bracelet on her wrist. "We're sisters, we shouldn't fight like this." "Why are you here, Grace?" She gave me her best beauty pageant winner's smile. "To make peace, of course. And to help you understand the situation better." "What kind of situation?" She pretended to sigh with relief, as if I was finally ready to hear something reasonable. "You see, Thomas's parents aren't just rich." She leaned forward, lowering her voice as if she were confiding a great secret to me. "They have old money. They have connections everywhere. This wedding should be perfect." I was silent, knowing that she hadn't finished the main thing yet. She looked at me again, but this time there was tension in her eyes. "The last installment has to be paid next week. Restaurant deposit, wedding planner, flowers." She twirled the wedding ring on her finger, trying to look carefree, but her hands betrayed nervousness. "If Mom and Dad can't contribute their share, it'll be awkward. Thomas's parents find out that they couldn't afford it. It's not just going to affect Mom and Dad, it's going to affect me and my future with Thomas." And here it is, the true motive of her visit. I nodded slowly. "So this visit is not really for reconciliation. It's for the money." "No." She began, but then corrected herself. I pressed my lips together, stifling a laugh. "But..." She got up quickly and came over to me, putting her hand on my arm. "Stella, please. You're my sister. I need your help. We need to make a big impression on Thomas's parents." I gently removed her hand, turned around and walked to the door, opening it wide. "I don't care what impression you want to make on Thomas's parents. I don't care what your ideal wedding should be. And I definitely don't care what any of you think." Grace froze, her face contorted with anger and confusion. "You're making a huge mistake," she hissed, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. "You're going to regret this." I smiled, feeling extremely calm. "No, Grace. For the first time in my life, I'm absolutely sure I won't regret it." She shot me a withering look, but I was no longer afraid of her judgment. She left, slamming the door loudly. A few days after Grace's visit, my phone lit up with a message. Sarah. Her college friend, the only one of Grace's friends who always treated me like a human being. "Stella, I didn't want to interfere, but I thought you should know this." I frowned, rereading the message. "Did you hear what happened at the country club? The night before, your parents finally confessed to Thomas's family." I read these words in Sarah's message several times, each time imagining the picture more clearly. They could no longer dodge calls from the wedding planner. They could no longer pretend that everything was under control, as if their family well-being was not bursting at the seams under the weight of their own ambitions. I could clearly see this scene before my eyes: the elegant dining room of the country club, sparkling glasses of sparkling wine, the dim light of expensive chandeliers, thick conversations conducted in hushed voices, and among all this, my parents, sitting across from Thomas's parents, who are used to a world where money flows like a river, where prestige is more important than feelings, where status it is of the utmost importance. At that moment, when my parents, entangled in their own lies, were forced to admit that they could not afford their share of wedding expenses, it seemed to me that I could hear their carefully constructed illusions crumbling. According to Sarah, Thomas's mother was practically purple with rage. For a family whose status was based on perfection, the news that their future relatives could not contribute their share of the money was not just unpleasant, it was humiliating. And no matter how hard they tried to contain their emotions, disappointment bordering on contempt could be read behind the cold looks and tense smiles. The wedding took place, but its scale has been significantly reduced. The honeymoon suite in the Maldives has been cancelled. The order for vintage champagne has been cancelled. Designer flower arrangements are simplified. Thomas's parents had to cover all the expenses on their own, and although the wedding still looked luxurious, it was no longer the grandiose fairy tale that Grace had dreamed of since childhood. Of course, I wasn't invited, but I didn't expect it. My grandparents received an invitation, but declined to attend, sending a polite note, citing previous commitments. Instead, we spent that Saturday together, having a picnic in their backyard, talking about small things, laughing, enjoying the simple joys of life, deliberately avoiding any mention of the wedding taking place on the other side of the city. A week later, wedding photos appeared on social media. I wasn't looking for them on purpose, but when I saw them, I couldn't resist flipping through one by one, a glass of wine in my hand, studying each picture. Grace was there, dressed in a perfect designer dress, with immaculate hair and a smile that was supposed to show happiness, but in which I caught something strained, tense. Thomas was standing next to him, looking prim and formal, like an expensive statue that fits perfectly into this meticulous entourage. And my parents. They were easy to recognize among the guests. In their new outfits, probably bought on credit, they tried to look like they belonged to this world, the world of old money, private country clubs and family estates. But their smiles were strained, their postures unnatural, as if they were trying to take a seat at the table but knew they would never be welcome there. Thomas's parents hardly appeared in the pictures. But the rare shots where they were said more than words, their expressions ranged from barely concealed irritation to open displeasure. In one particularly revealing photo, Thomas's mother looked at my parents with the kind of expression that is usually reserved for something unpleasant found on the sole of someone's shoe. I closed the album and put the phone aside, feeling surprisingly calm. In the following weeks, Sarah sent me updates from time to time. Grace and Thomas moved into the house his parents bought them as a wedding present. My parents rarely went there. Apparently, they were not exactly what Thomas's family imagined ideal relatives to be. Too noisy. Too simple. It's too out of place. And now that the wedding was over, they weren't so eager to be invited to Sunday family dinners. I haven't spoken to my parents or Grace since the wedding. And I doubt I'll ever do it again. But I'm sitting here in my apartment, watching the sunset turn the city sky shades of gold, listening to the muffled sounds of the evening city, feeling the warmth of a cup of tea in my hands, and I realize that I've finally come to terms with the fact that some bridges that once burned down must remain ashes.